I think Easter Sunday, and you'll have packed churches all over our country. I think it would be a beautiful time. And it's just about the timeline that I think is right.
So that got a lot of headlines from yesterday. President Trump telling me about his plan to get America back working again by Easter Sunday. An idea he says he hopes can happen despite concerns from the health experts. President Trump's own task force member, Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying that an Easter timeline will be, quote, very flexible. Two people with me now who worked in the West Wing during times of crisis join me. Leon Panetta, former White House Chief of Staff for President Clinton, and Karl Rove, former White House Deputy Chief of Staff for President George Bush, and a Fox News contributor. And gentlemen, it's great to have you on today. I don't know how it is in Monterey or Austin, but thanks for being here. It sure is quiet in New York City. To Mr. Panetta, why don't we begin with you, Mr. Secretary? What is your sense of what he is trying to project in that interview from yesterday?
Well, look, I think those of us, Carl and I, who've worked for presidents, know that presidents have great hopes about what they want to achieve. But at the same time, they also have to confront the realities that they're dealing with. And ultimately, the realities prevail. And so I think the president has expressed his hope for where he would like to go, but I think he also understands that the first priority in this country is to save lives. And if we save lives, I think we ultimately can save our economy as well.
Yeah, Carl, what do you make of, let's just take the headline on its face. Start there.
Well, I think that's a goal, an aspiration. And as Secretary Panetta said, look, we want our presidents to project optimism. When Franklin Roosevelt said at the height of the Depression, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, you know, that wasn't exactly true, but it gave people a sense of optimism that they could overcome. I think what's interesting to me is the president has done, I think, something that's very important. In a moment of crisis like this, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you need to have somebody designated inside the White House who's going to basically run herd on the issue, and that's Vice President Pence. And then you need somebody with accomplished background in the specific issue to be the staff director, and they've got Ambassador Bricks, who's a terrific individual. And between the two of them, they're doing something that every president needs to have done, which is pull together everybody. It's ultimately going to be the president's decision, and it's not going to be an easy one, but pull together everybody so they can agree upon a set of facts, maybe disagree, find the areas where they disagree about the facts, but then hone the arguments on both sides of any question so that when they go forward and say, Mr. President, a decision needs to be made, they can give him the best possible options at either side and the best possible arguments either in favor or against a particular position. And I think the president's got the structure in place to help him.
My sense with them yesterday, Secretary Panetta, was similar to what your observation there is from afar, Carl. And that is you've got your team on both sides of you, but you're pushing your team toward a certain goal and an objective. What he stated yesterday was that we can't stay closed forever. You know, we are America, and millions of people who were watched yesterday and probably watching again today are in agreement on that. However, the public health concern, you cannot set back the gains that you've achieved already. And my sense was he's pushing the positive, and the scientists fall back on the data. And I think, Mr. Panetta, I think we can understand both sides at work here.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. And you have to understand both sides. That's the president's responsibility, is to try to get this country to respond to what is a national crisis. And that's what he's focused on. And at the same time, he himself has some hopes about what we can do in order to deal with that crisis. But you know, he's dealing with his advisors, and as Carl points out, you've got close advisors that are hopefully presenting him with the facts, with the realities, and with the options. And ultimately, the president has to decide what course he's going to take. But it's pretty clear right now that in dealing with a national crisis, that it requires a national response. And frankly, there's only one person who can provide that national response, and that's the President of the United States. So I think it's important now to be very clear about what our strategy is and where we're going, so that the American people who are resilient can pull together and support that strategy.
Let me go to last night's briefing. This is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was not with us in the afternoon. A lot of people had questions about the relationship. The president told me that they're good. Everything's okay. So here he is when asked about the Easter Sunday timeline from last night.
You got to be very flexible, and on a literally day by day and week by week basis, you need to evaluate the feasibility of what you're trying to do. And John, you asked for, what kind of metrics, what kind of data. When you look at the country, I mean, obviously, no one is going to want to tone down things when you see what's going on in a place like New York City. I mean, that's just, good public health practice and common sense.
Carl, when I listen to that, I almost hear them thinking out loud. Just like we watch that Johns Hopkins map every hour of every day, they're doing the same thing. And they're making decisions based on the numbers they're coming up with. That's what I take from that answer there.
Yeah. Well, and I also, though, to go back a little bit, remember the president talked about the importance of flattening the curve. He clearly has taken this important principle that you've got to be in a place to, before you reignite economic activity in any area of the country, you've got to be careful about making certain that you're on the downward side of that curve. That is to say, you no longer have the number of incidences and hospitalizations rising, but instead they've plateaued and they may be beginning to decline. Because you don't want to reignite that. You want to get to a point where you've got a good sense that you're on the downward side of the curve, and that allowing people to move more freely and beginning economic activity is not going to jab that number right back up. But he's imbibed that obviously at the beginning. And believe me, in the years that I was at the White House, some of the scariest briefings I can remember attending were not necessarily the ones about the war on terror. They were the ones about the SARS epidemic in 2002,
Really?
2003, and the possibility of pandemics, because these are very difficult to manage and very difficult, once unleashed, to get control of.
Very interesting. Secretary Panetta, Vice President Pence yesterday held up that sign, 15 days to slow the spread. I think he held it up probably 16 times during the time that we spent with him. And if that's the message, today's day 10 and Monday is day 15. And how do you look at the way that they are putting that message out there to remind people constantly about what their plan was starting a week and a half ago?
Look, I think it's important to focus on what steps need to be taken in order to contain this virus. And as Carl pointed out, the most important goal right now is to flatten the curve. If we're still rising in New York and New Orleans and other parts of the country, then obviously it's very difficult, even after 15 days, to suddenly say we shouldn't pay attention to the problems we're facing. So I think, as Dr. Fauci himself said, we've got to be flexible here. And to do that, obviously, we have to implement social distancing and the guidelines that the vice president held up. We've got to provide the supplies necessary for hospitals. We've got to provide the testing necessary. I mean, that ought to be a principal focus. And now we've got this economic plan. Thank God Republicans and Democrats have come together to provide this assistance to get companies and businesses back on their feet. All of that is extremely important. And I'm not sure you can kind of put a timeline to that. You've got to look at the conditions, you've got to look at the facts, and then decide what the strategy should be.
Thank you, sir, very much. Leon Panetta in Monterey, Carl Rove in Austin, Texas. Thank you, men, for coming on today.